and it's my pleasure to introduce Yannis Theocharis from the Department of Governance at the Technical University of Munich, who's going to talk today on harmful speech and content moderation preferences in social media. So over to you, Yannis.
Hi everyone. First of all, thanks so much for this invitation. Can you hear me okay and see the presentation fine? All right, that's great. So it's a great pleasure to be here, of course. I'll be presenting you work that is co-authored with Spiros Kosmidis from the University of Oxford and Francisca Prado and Jan Zielinski. They're both at my team at the Technical University of Munich. The topic is about harmful speech and content moderation preferences. Just to say from the outset that the technical part of this paper is pretty straightforward. It's experiments. So I will devote considerable time to explain the background and set the stage for the research puzzle, as this is something that I would be particularly keen to hear your thoughts on. All right, so back in 2017, with Josh Tucker, Molly Roberts, and Pablo Barbera, we wrote an article for the Journal of Democracy that basically tried to provide a framework for better understanding the effect of social media on democracy. And one of the main arguments we made in that paper was that while social media as a technology is, of course, not neutral, it should not be understood as inherently bad or an inherently good technology for democracy, but rather as a technology that provides opportunities for both those wishing to benefit and those wishing to harm democracy. And of course, there are tons of examples, protesters being mobilized via social media during the Arab Spring, the use of social media for disinformation campaigns by Russia, the harassment of political actors by paid trolls, and the list is very long. So things have not changed much since that framework was provided. It's still the case that no achievement of social media has generated more praise, but also more concern among academics, among legal scholars, policymakers, and the epistemic elite more broadly, than the capacity of these platforms to democratize the ability to reach a mass audience. And that is because, along with this greatest of expansions in the capacity of human expression, social media have actually multiplied opportunities for harmful speech. And what's interesting is that this holds both for citizens and for political elites. As you can see here in this slide, 4 out of 10 Americans have experienced online harassment, including physical threats, though that seems to be a pretty conservative number. Other studies have put that to 85%. Now, the problem with this is that for all the democratic benefits of social media, the fact that toxic speech tends to silence exactly the groups that stand to benefit the most from the expansion of freedom of expression that is, offered through this technology, is highly problematic for a political system that thrives on diversity and the pluralism of voices. So for this reason, many people today are worried about the rise of a culture of incivility, especially online, that destroys our democracies. So is there a crisis of civility? Well, that's a very interesting question because it really depends on how you define civility, right? So philosophers have been positioning the role of civility in, the public sphere strictly in conjunction with deliberation and the public good. So if you've read Habermas, if you've read Rawls, for example, but even if you go as far back as Aristotle, in ancient Greece and the idea of civility as part of citizenship, all these theorists have argued that civility as a normative ideal is a requirement for democratic discourse and a virtue whose absence basically carries very negative consequences for democracy. Why is that? Well, apart from civility being a type of behavior that displays good manners, character, and virtue, in these normative visions, but also the normative visions of more recent theorists, it is important because it promotes rational discussion that defines the kind of discourse that guides democratic societies. You see here some popular quotes: civility is what enables the social order to exist, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting is that this view is not universal. among philosophers. Others have noted that, these type of normative accounts that emphasize the value of civility in terms of character and manners and virtue downplay the importance of fierce, of unpredictable, and even unrestrained, uncivil debate, right? And that's a core feature of democratic emancipation. So if you've read theorists like Lyotard, like Marcuse, for example, these have pointed out that imposing civility could stifle what is the righteous indignation of certain societal groups that intentionally actually use loud, militant, and even uncivil methods to achieve freedom and equality. And we should not get rid of incivility online, say some prominent American researchers of incivility in a recent article. Why? Well, their justification is because an emphasis on incivility privileges the groups that have the power to impose a definition on a conversation, which means that marginalized groups will be more likely to be viewed as uncivil, and that is hugely problematic because incivility may actually be required for those groups to be heard. So the takeaway message here is that some elite understandings of civility, permeated by the idea of rational accord as they are, may be at odds with the individuality, uniqueness, antagonism, lack of restraint, and impoliteness that basically characterizes much of everyday citizens' lives, and especially, I would say, on social media. So we have these two competing understandings of the role of civility and incivility in public discourse, but is there a line to be drawn anywhere? So in other words, where does civility end and incivility begins? And that's a hugely important question that I've been myself grappling with my other work with computational methods when trying to classify incivility, and more specifically, when trying to distinguish impoliteness from incivility. So we really dig deep here to understand these differences. Modern approaches to this question are influenced by the speech affordances that are brought about by the internet. And they have proposed some red lines with regards to when speech stops being merely impolite and crosses the border to incivility. And as you can see on this slide, prominent new media scholar, Theocharis, for example, says that, while poor, rude manners and even profanity may, abide to etiquette, they're not necessarily uncivil. But speech, on the other hand, that involves attacks on specific social groups is actually what sets democratic society back. So the way I understand this is that the fundamental normative idea behind this position is that civility must be linked to respect for the political equality of opponents, which citizens must be committed to in any discussion, right? So this means that an attack on somebody based on their membership in a particular social group violates political equality and crosses an important line. And despite the normative disagreements about the role of civility, a reading of the literature and of the broader policy debate around harmful speech on social media suggests that there's a general agreement among the epistemic elite, and by that I mean academics, journalists, civil society organizations, political elites, and the civic integrity teams of many platforms, that speech undermining democratic traditions by targeting individuals based on their protected characteristics is unacceptable, and it's inadmissible to public discourse. And as you know, in the context of social media, such language is common and bears implications. As you will see on the right side of the slide, in an open letter to Twitter's top 20 advertisers, more than 40 civil society organizations warned of the unprecedented and unacceptable rise of abuse, harassment, racist language and imagery, and also clear threats of violence after Elon Musk took over Twitter. So basically, regardless of how far back you trace the beginning of the debate on civility, this social media dominated world looks very different from the time these debates were, basically started. And incivility, toxic speech has become a major concern to political, communication scholars, legal scholars, journalists, policymakers. Why is that? Well, there are good reasons why. We have a ton of work in political science theorizing and measuring online toxicity. And most of these contributions do focus around the concepts of incivility, racial, political, and ethnic other types of intolerance, actually, and violent threats. Some examples, there's a lot of quantitative research, especially in that. 20% of all messages addressed to Congress members on Twitter are uncivil. 5 to 20% of those This is the case also for many European countries. This is some research that we've done actually. 21% of the overall conversation of Twitter during the COVID-19 pandemic was characterized as toxic. In a really cool study looking at basically all Reddit comments that have ever been posted, Sun and colleagues found that incivility consistently represented 10% of all Reddit comments. And we've seen also a 23% increase in incivility over a decade on Twitter posts by politicians, by political elites, right? Of course, we know that violent tweets, so tweets with violent threats, for example, spread widely through communication networks. They can reach easily people, even those who basically have no ties to, marginalized producers of violent speech. And why do we care about all this? We care because it is the same empirical research that shows that incivility and other manifestations of toxic speech, like intolerance or threatening language, represent mainly a bad thing. I cannot even begin to summarize the studies showing negative effects of incivility, both to the victims, but also to those who witness it, right? They include negative psychological and social outcomes, boosting aggressiveness, retaliation, boosting polarization, feelings of anger. And of course, we've also seen that intolerance and threats are leading especially minorities to fear for their lives and withdraw from online debates. And we know also that violent political rhetoric has also been found to induce polarization and actually be a precursor of actual violence. Now, this is the universe of bad effects of toxic speech. There's also some research showing positive effects of incivility. Of course, incivility is emotionally arising when you're witnessing it. It has sometimes been found as being able to mobilize citizens and increase their interest in politics, and even increase perception of the credibility of certain information when there's conflict around the post, for example. There are other positive effects mainly found in management studies, like bonding with coworkers, helping certain groups get their point across in a corporate environment, drawing attention, igniting interest in a topic, and a few other things. So against this background, it is really not very surprising that content moderation has become sort of a flagship topic in the debates about how to reform social media spaces. And, I will emphasize here that this is nevertheless an almost completely unexplored topic empirically in political science and communication. So the epistemic elite has expressed its opposition to letting speech run wild on social media platforms. And as you will see on the right side here, from the paper by Jeffrey Howard of UCL, there is an active philosophical debate about harmful speech ought to be moderated on social media without, however, harming free speech at the same time. There are many proposals about how this can happen without, the United States, for example, violating the First Amendment. So you'll read stuff by lawyers ranging from how to actually revise Section 230 to specific steps that social media companies, but also governments, can take without even having to touch it, basically. So in case you're not familiar here, I'm referring to Section 230 of the 1996 Communication Decency Act, which basically shields platforms against legal liability for any content that their users are posting on the platform. So the concern is such that there are currently more than 100 legislative initiatives in 34 US state legislatures and dozens of legislative proposals introduced in the US Congress seeking to reform social media platforms along the lines. Now, all this is very interesting. But what we are struck when we are reading this debate is how little citizens matter in this process. So unless one adopts a purely cynical approach to politics and governments, politicians don't care about citizens, they only care about the money they get from Zuckerberg and Musk, then unless you adopt a cynical approach, surely you will realize that it is in the citizens' name and for the citizens' enrichment and or their protection that governments and social media companies develop speech regulation or fail to, right? And yet we know close to nothing about citizens' views on the question of what constitutes harmful speech, let alone what they would like to see done with this type of speech online, right? And here's the thing, if even if citizens' perceptions of what constitutes harmful speech are in line with what normative theorists have long praised as valuable for democracy, we do not have empirical evidence about how exposure to such speech might translate into behavioral outcomes, and specifically to how speech should or should not be curbed or even censored. So just an example, does it mean that if toxic content that is abhorrent to users, it is inadmissible to public discourse from a normative and community standards perspective? Let's take rape and death threats here, right? Is it that majorities will want to see this content flagged or downgraded or even removed and the user suspended? So this is important because this gap in our understanding of citizens' content moderation preferences has very significant repercussions. I'm saying this because besides content moderation, ordinary users have few affordances with which to meaningfully engage with what is and what is not admissible in social media conversations, right? So besides moderation, there's very little voice about what is said in the technological environments in which they spend a considerable part of their days, which means that in the face of deteriorating public discourse on platforms, unless they choose to exercise a voice and press for a change in the status quo, the alternative options are loyalty, stop staying in the platform even though you no longer find the experience pleasant, or exit, as per Hirschman, right? So understanding citizens' voice on the matter is critical for anticipating if there can ever be a critical mass that could push harder, either through voice or exit for regulation. Now, what do users want? Well, we know that academics, human rights groups, and social media companies are generally aligned in their understanding of what constitutes inadmissible speech, okay? They're able to both define it and to recognize it when they see it. As I mentioned earlier, the line is crossed with attacks based on group protected characteristics. If you see, for example, Twitter's and Meta's policy, it's all about that, right? So you may not promote violence against or directly attack or threaten other people on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, etc. And then Meta, we define hate speech as direct attacks against people rather than concepts or institutions on the basis of what we call protected characteristics, race, ethnicity, and so on. Okay, but when it comes to citizens, it is much harder to infer what they want, right? To take the United States as an example, on the one hand, we have a substantial proportion of the US public considering social media to be bad for democracy, and the majority of Americans saying that they're worn out by political posts, and discussions saying that they find them much less civil than offline, right? And we also know that in the US, the majority of the population think that even non-political discussions exhibit high levels of toxicity. At the same time, you have high volume Twitterers, and these are the people who are most likely to experience harassment on Twitter, being less likely to view the tone of civility or in discussions as a major problem. And most importantly, as you can see in the graph here, many Americans think that people are too easily offended and that the social media climate is becoming too censorious, which means that some citizens might be reluctant to see forms of toxicity curbed and the harm that potentially comes with them, of course, in the name of freedom of speech, right? So in this paper, we ask if citizens want toxic content moderated, and if yes, how this aligns with the normative ideals of the epistemic elite and platforms' community standards and policies against harmful speech. But most importantly, we're interested about the behavioral correspondence between types of toxic speech and content moderation preferences. Now, establishing the effects of witnessing toxic speech is a very difficult task. And that's first and foremost because users hardly agree on what constitutes speech with the potential to harm and which is in need of moderation. But also because different types of toxic speech may be perceived differently, but also elicit different responses, right? We've got a ton of research showing that individuals may have very different attitudes towards offensiveness and offensive speech and platform regulation, depending on their partisanship, right? We know, for example, that aggressive behavior and insults are means for differentiating in-groups from out-groups, which leads people to perceive out-group attitudes and behaviors as being much more extreme than they actually are. And then finally, of course, we have the argument that incivility is in the eye of the beholder, right? So past work has found systematic variation in the perceptions of incivility based on the identity of those targeted by uncivil speech. With my group, before we trained the machine learning classifier, we used thousands of Turingers for manually labeling incivility, only to soon realize that Turingers who said were Democrats were more likely to label as uncivil content that was clearly coming from Republicans. But of course, that's another paper. So what are our expectations here? So as I mentioned, we are interested in the behavioral outcomes of being exposed to toxic speech, specifically on sanctioning others based on available types of content moderation. And content moderation ranges from mild tactics that algorithmically reduce the importance of content in people's feeds, and give other methods that give opportunities to the users to flag content, to more severe and censorious tactics like deleting content, suspending user accounts, and so on and so forth. So the three main toxic behaviors I have outlined, and I have spoken about incivility, intolerance, and violent threats, embed different levels of severity, with violent threats being obviously a far more serious offense than, for example, calling people names or using profanity. Now, given what the literature has shown about the effects of incivility and intolerance and violent threats, what I just showed a few slides back, it would be reasonable to assume that the last would probably be linked to more stringent forms of moderation. But actually, whether these toxic behaviors are linked in a sort of linear way with more severe types of content moderation is not clear at all. So there are at least two arguments that can challenge the assumption that starker types of toxic speech would lead to more severe content moderation. And I'm mentioning them here because I think it's important to mention them. We're not testing for this as mechanisms in the paper. So the first reason why people might not be reporting toxic content, or at least some types of it, is what one might call desensitization or normalization, right? And it's based on considerable research, mainly qualitative research, such as the work of Sarah Sobieras you see here. And that's especially on groups affected heavily by toxicity, such as women, feminist activists, and minorities. And some of this research shows that these groups have actually learned to live with these types of behavior. So the type of argument that you will see here, amounts to something like, I'm used to it so much that it doesn't even bother me anymore. So I don't even care to report it, right? I cannot let this affect me anymore. Now, the second argument for leaving harmful content unmoderated has not been sufficiently empirically explored. Actually, to my knowledge, there's no research on this, but if you know something, please let me know. So that argument stems from legal texts, and in some ways it is tied to the American free speech paradigm and the First Amendment. So according to this idea, people must live with the occasional harmful speech because the cost of censoring it in any way would be too high for democracy. And this idea basically supports that people, as autonomous individuals, are entitled to make up their own minds, and to do so, they need to be exposed to a wide range of speech, including especially speech that might be unpopular. So in short, a preference to not have harmful content moderated might stem from the belief that such content actually needs to be there to help citizens understand the types of views others have and, know what to expect, know how to adjust their behaviors accordingly, or, as it is normatively desirable by the First Amendment, actually engage in counter speech to eliminate harmful speech. There's this very famous quote by Justice Brandeis that the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. Okay, to measure the causal effects of toxic speech, we designed randomized experiments where respondents were exposed to Facebook posts modeled after real content we found on the internet. And for reasons related to the connection between incivility and outgroup dynamics I discussed a few slides back, we were very cautious that respondents may likely identify content as being more uncivil or toxic when they perceive the offender as attacking their in-group or somebody who they tend to favor due to their ideological predispositions. So we decided to see the effects of harmful speech across 3 different targets. In the first experiment I'm going to show you, the target is a member of the LGBTQ community. This is a group that is generally viewed more favorably by the Democrats. So we've looked, and there are tons of studies by the Pew Research Center showing that Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to favor same-sex marriage and to say that greater acceptance of transgender people is good for society. In the second experiment, the target is a driver of a pickup truck with visibly ultra-religious Jesus saves type of bumper stickers, much like the one you see in the photo here. So the idea here is that the target may evoke the image of a highly religious white American who demographically belongs to, but also is favored by and identifies with the Republican Party. And we know, of course, that Democrats and Republicans are sharply divided on the role of religion in society. Republicans are typically far more likely to view churches and Christian organizations as a force for good, and the decline of religion as a bad thing for society. Now, the target in the final experiment is billionaires. I know that might sound strange. So according to, again, to the Pew Research Center, Democrats and Republicans have become much more negative about the impact of billionaires on society, though for different reasons, right? And Democrats generally tend to favor them less than Republicans, right? So we thought about billionaires in our study playing a threefold role, basically. First, it is not a social identity category, and therefore it was not likely to provoke as emotionally intense a response as the other 2 categories. The second thing is kind of obvious. The odds of anyone being close to an ultra-rich person are extremely low, right? So billionaires can act as a sort of control category that allows us to observe whether moderation preferences, especially in response to violent threats, are comparatively milder when directed at a target that basically would be impossible to engage with offline. And third, using billionaires as a target allows us to address dynamics pertaining to status divides and intergroup competition from the perspective of envy up, scorn down, as Fiske would have it. What do I mean by that? Well, billionaires are clearly an upper class target, so they can provoke the ire of those who perceive themselves as being of lower status, and they are keen on punching up. And the religious pickup truck driver, by contrast, basically allows us to observe effects among those keen on punching down, because the owners of such pickup trucks may be stereotypically viewed as belonging to the working class. Further information about our research design, like I said, 3 pre-registered randomized experiments. We carried them out in July and October 2022 on Prolific. You see here the sample sizes, and we got approval from the ethics board of the University of Oxford. Now, coming to the concepts and measures, our interest here is 3 manifestations of toxic speech. Again, intolerance, incivility, and violent threats. And we consider those just as the literature does. So as a civil language, we consider basically any form of offensive language and general slurs, but excluding group-related slurs, such as homophobic or racial slurs, because that would be predominantly intolerance, right? We conceptualize threats and threatening language as involving allusions to physical violence, danger or physical harm, or endangering the security and existence in either explicit or subtle ways. So kind of borrowing also the Twitter definition here. I can very happily talk about differences between the different the different concepts here later on if you want to. So we opted for a design that contains incivility, intolerance, or threats as separate treatments. So what you see here is a threatening post was just driving behind this guy with a collection of Jesus saves bumper stickers on this pickup truck. Tell you what, next time I see one of them, I'll punch them in the face. That's a threatening post. The intolerant post says the same thing, but tell you what, why don't you take your pickup truck and drive elsewhere? Your kind is not welcome here. The uncivil post is basically the exact same post, is just at the end, the person is swearing and is calling this, drivers of this kind, religious fanatics. And these 3 treatments were compared to a control group that targets the relevant group, but without any toxic language, right? That's our baseline case. So I was just driving behind this guy with a collection of Jesus Save bumper stickers on the pickup truck, and there's just a thumbs down, nothing else. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that we had a clear baseline. So we also exposed a portion of our participants to a placebo group that contained no information about the target, right? So I just watched the movie everyone is talking about, cannot say that it was great. What I want to emphasize here is that obviously the threatening condition is much milder compared to what one sees on the internet today. But nevertheless, the way it is phrased, it fully violates most popular platforms' terms of service. And maybe I would say the intolerant post is marginally there as well. So our outcome variable measured preferences over content moderation. So after exposing the subject to the treatment, we invited them to respond to the following prompt. In your view, how should social media companies like Facebook and Twitter handle the post above? And we gave them those options: leave it, do nothing, place a warning label on the post, reduce how many people can see the post, permanently remove it, or suspend the person's account. I've colored them in different colors because I want to emphasize here that with the 2 options, the post disappears, whereas with the other 3 options, even if it's downgraded, the post still stays there, right? So some people will still see it. And let's get the findings. So what I have here acts both as a manipulation check and as an indication as to whether our respondents evaluate these posts in the same way as the literature does. So upon exposure, we asked respondents to select which type of language they thought best described the language featured in the tweet. And they were given 4 concepts to rank order: civil, uncivil, intolerant, and threatening language. We used a randomized presentation of those concepts to avoid order effects. And what we did was to calculate the percentages of participants ranking one of the concepts first as their best description of the language in the social media post versus those concepts that were not ranked first. And we did this for all experiments. So in line with our expectations, incivility was the concept ranked most often as first, given an uncivil intervention. Intolerance, threatening language were those most ranked first, given an intolerant and threatening intervention. In the placebo group, most respondents ranked the first item as civil, and in the civil but sort of anti-target group, the most frequently selected item for the best fit were actually intolerant and civil. So one thing to note here is that when examining these figures across studies, we found that our experimental interventions for both the LGBTQ and the highly religious targets were similarly successful, but those exposed to the threats against billionaires seem to be significantly less likely to perceive the post as threatening, which obviously is not because of how we phrase the stimulus. The religious and billionaire targets were attacked using the exact same phrases. It's just that the subjects in the billionaire target experiments seem to be less sensitive about the toxic content, right? So the takeaway message here is that the respondents' evaluations show that they are able to associate features of uncivil, intolerant, and threatening speech well enough with which one of those manifestations of toxic speech, and to distinguish them in ways that are similar to how they are distinguished in academic literature. Okay, now, to estimate the effect of the experimental stimuli on the preferences for taking action against a post, we estimate the logistic regression, pulling the data from all the 3 studies. And we use a binarized version of our outcome variable here because our main quantity of interest is whether users support any form of action against a post, right? So what you see here is the effects of treatments on support for some of the forms of content moderation I showed you, right? So the dependent variable is set to 1 if the respondent selected any of the options available. So to estimate the pool average treatment effect, we had indicator variables for the different studies, right? And condition on the respondent's partisanship. And as you can see, the baseline category for the treatment assignment is the baseline post, the anti-group post without any toxic language. And the coefficients that I'm displaying there in black indicate effects relative to assignment to such a post. The omitted category when it comes to the target of the attack is the highly religious target, and the coefficients displayed in green, so in the second kind of order, show the effects of viewing an attack against either a billionaire or LGBTQ people relative to reading a post about the highly religious pickup driver. So what do we see? We see that relative to the control group, we observe an about 20% point increase in the probability of support for taking action against the post when uncivil language, civil speech is used. Exposure to intolerance is basically almost the same. And the strongest effect for moderation preferences is observed when subjects view a post that includes threatening language, right? So when our subjects were randomly assigned to read content that included a variation of "I will punch them in the face," support for content moderation increased by 42 percentage points, right? This effect is smaller when billionaires are targeted with threatening language, slightly larger when highly religious are attacked, and the largest when LGBTQ community is attacked, right? Which clearly tells us that the identity of the target matters for the respondent's evaluation of whether social media posts containing toxic speech merit moderation. So this answers the question of what is the effect of toxic speech on content moderation preferences. What it doesn't tell us much about is the preferred types of content moderation. So here you can see the participants' preferences for the specific actions they want the platforms to take. In the LGBTQ experiment, we find that about 11% of respondents want to remove both uncivil and intolerant social media posts. When the post is threatening, nearly 25% of respondents say that the post should be removed, and basically about as many say that the person's account should be suspended. And as can be clearly seen here, overall, people in the threatening social media post condition, it's always at the bottom, opt for more stringent forms of moderation than those in the uncivil and the intolerant group. What's also clear here, if you look at the bottom left panel, is that when billionaires are targeted, we see that across all treatment groups, much fewer individuals will opt for any moderation. Now, what is the most astonishing finding here? Well, with the exception of the case of LGBTQ, across all studies, large majorities do not support any kind of moderation, not even for the threatening condition, right? With suspending a user's account being the least preferred option across the board, except the LGBTQ case. Now, I think that this has major ramifications. Why? Well, for one thing, because Democrats are overrepresented in this sample, like all prolific or mTOR examples, which I think makes the finding about limited desire to demand content moderation more credible, right? Because, of course, Democrats are those more likely to demand moderation when compared to independents and Republicans. It's, in fact, exactly these people, if there were any, if there were ever any, who could create the critical mass to make platforms more responsive to content moderation, right? So if this sample was balanced by partisanship, we think the demand for content moderation would be even less than what you see here, right? In case you're wondering, we did analyze the effect of age on moderation preferences to examine if the variation in our outcome variable is due to a relatively younger participant pool. We found no profound differences between younger and older groups when demanding moderation. At the same time, I promised further analysis because specific groups might be more responsive when they're exposed to offensive and toxic language targeted at social groups they might generally feel warmer towards. So we try to visualize here partisan heterogeneity in demands for content moderation. And in the top panel of the figure, we visualize the contrasts in the probabilities of demanding action from the platform. So we calculate the mean differences in the probability that a Democrat demands more action compared to a Republican. So higher values in the graph mean greater demand for moderation among Democrats. And the bottom panel shows the full results by partisan group to offer you a fuller picture of the treatment effect calculated for each group. So as you can see here in the top panel, Democrats are more responsive to toxic language directed at members of the LGBTQ community, with the effect also showing variation across treatments and across different targets. So what we see here, for example, is that Democrats are 20% more likely to demand moderation when they're exposed to an anti-target post without toxic speech, 25% more likely when exposed to incivility, 45% more likely in the case of intolerance, and 38% in case of threats. Interestingly, as I'm pointing with the arrows below, they are also more responsive than Republicans when exposed to toxic speech directed at a group Republicans tend to identify with, right? And here I'm referring to the experiment with a pickup truck driver, where Democrats are on average more demanding for platform intervention in all cases, even though, as you can also see, these differences are not statistically distinguishable from each other. Now, as we were working on this, Musk took over Twitter, and there was such a huge media spectacle about this that it made us wonder if the picture I just presented changed, given that he's a free speech fundamentalist whose lack of support for content moderation has alarmed consumers, advertisers, and anyone who's generally, weighs protection from harmful content more heavily than freedom of speech. So to examine whether our causal effects and our conclusion of limited moderation demands would hold, we replicated the LGBTQ study in November 2022. I'm not sure what your guess is, but we found exactly the same, right? So our findings and conclusions remain virtually unchanged. Now, I'm going to close with a final set of studies. What these studies that I just discussed confirm is that the target matters and it affects the levels of demand for content moderation. So what we wanted to do next were two things. First, add targets that are clearly political. And second, since we can have both Democrats and Republicans in our sample, use a design that allows us to examine content moderation in a scenario where a sizable proportion of our respondents can identify with the victim or the perpetrator and see, if they rationalize toxic speech against out partisans as potentially not being a big deal, basically. So we know that partisanship tends to invite a glorification of the in-group and hate for the out-group. Actually, this literature is so long that this is almost considered an empirical regularity, right? Especially in recent years of affective polarization. So we conducted two parallel studies, one where a Republican is being attacked and another one where a Democrat is a target. And the design was exactly the same as before, the treatments, everything, right? Only this time we opted for larger sample sizes to make sure that we have sufficient power. As in study one, we asked respondents the same questions about what best describes the posts they witnessed and found a very, very similar pattern. Actually, this looks even better than the previous graph. They're fully able to identify different types of toxic speech. How do they respond when a partisan is attacked? Well, the picture we draw is similar to what I showed you before. Okay, intolerant and uncivil language causes a 22% point increase in demand for content moderation compared to the control group. And violent threats are still the biggest driver of stricter moderation preferences, causing a 52 percentage point increase in support for content moderation. The important question to ask here is, of course, does respondents' partisanship determine their preference for moderation? Well, while theoretically one could expect more sensitivity from the respondents when their co-partisans are under attack, as I'm showing you here, when a Democrat is targeted, Democrats do not demand significantly more moderation, and conversely, Republicans do not support more moderation when their co-partisan is attacked either, right? So the sole exception here is a treatment with intolerant language, where Democrats appear to be more inclined to support moderation when a Democrat is targeted. But I wouldn't call this motivated reasoning. Happy to discuss that always. As before, this demand for content moderation is very, very limited. Okay, to summarize, we find that more severe forms of harmful language both increase support for content moderation in general, and they trigger preferences for harsher response from the platforms. Okay, those who prefer that no content moderation whatsoever is deployed are the large majority in all experiments, except when LGBTQ and partisans are attacked with violent threats. So the fact of the matter is that while citizens can fully recognize different types of harmful language, their views of what is and what is not admissible to public discourse seems to be vastly different to that of the epistemic elites, and certainly not in line with what normative theorists think is good for democracy, right? And I must not forget to mention here, especially given the debate in political science about different normative role of incivility and intolerance, that when it comes to moderating these two different types of harmful speech, moderation preferences are basically identical, when intolerance is much worse, right? When support for content moderation does manifest, it takes the form of mildest sort of forms. Complete content removal and banning users are the least popular options. Who the target is seems to make a difference, right? And of course, generally demands for content moderation, Democrats are far more likely to demand content moderation than Republicans in all studies, except when it comes to the case of billionaires. But there is generally very, very limited evidence that we see moderation through a partisan lens. I'm going to close with one final thing. Probably going to try to answer something that's in the mind of some of you. Is what we're observing here American exceptionalism? Is it because Americans are so obsessed with the libertarian reading of the First Amendment and unfettered freedom of speech in general that we see such lack of moderation here, so lack of preference for moderation? So this is a sneak peek for a follow-up paper. In results that I did not present here today, we look at specific mechanisms, and more particularly into the role of values such as freedom of speech, and how this might completely override the idea that unfettered freedom of speech may harm minorities in particular, right? So this research involves several experiments and a comparative study of several countries. What you see here are responses to a question from a survey fielded in Greece, Austria, United States, and Germany, asking respondents, among other things, in general, how important is freedom of speech relative to the harm it might cause, right? So this was a 7-point scale ranging from 1, which stands from strongly prefer freedom of speech, to 7, which stands for strongly prefer protection from harm. I don't know about what you think about that, but it does not look like protection from harm compared to free speech is a priority for any of the populations that in these countries here. Again, this is a question of mechanism, but I think this is kind of a nice snapshot into what might be happening behind everything that I try to show you here today. So with this, I'm going to close this presentation. I'm at exactly 45 minutes, as I was told. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Fascinating. I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. If you want to ask one, you can raise your virtual hand. Have a physical hand raised next to me here. So, John, would you like to kick off?
It's not exactly a question, but there's a very nice natural experiment you could do right now. The Musk effect has moved a few million people off of Twitter onto Mastodon, and each Mastodon instance has a different moderation policy. And in fact, there's tools for choosing a Mastodon instance based on your moderation preferences. So if you could get the statistics from those, that would be really interesting to contrast with the traditional centralized platforms. I think it would be really great. I mean, I don't know if you looked at it at all, but I'm on one instance where I experienced moderation, which was very reasonable, but I switched instances because I wanted a different kind of moderation. And it was just simply to do with a policy that banned postings about for-profit organizations. So it wasn't about abuse content, it was a bit more style of content. But if you look on what's it called, instances.social, you can see there's a collection of moderation rule, and you can then pick an instance based on those. So it'd be interesting if you've looked at that anyway. It'd be really cool to hear.
Thanks.
Okay, anyone want to follow up with a question? Okay, so I have a couple of things I'd like to explore. I suppose there's an issue about whose opinions matter most when it comes to content moderation. We we saw how when Musk took over Twitter, a lot of advertisers fled because they were concerned about their advertisements appearing alongside possibly toxic content. So does the opinion of business matter more than citizens about content moderation?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think I can answer if the opinion of business matters more. I think it matters very much. I mean, it doesn't even have to be business advertising there. It can be the social media companies themselves, right? What strikes me when I think of this is that if it was only about business interests, right, why would Facebook and Twitter do all this effort to provide those long posts about why they want to do more content moderation, why they want to respect more the discursive atmosphere in the platform, and actually take active steps, take citizens' opinions into consideration. And of course, there's interesting diversity in how much citizens' opinions are taken into consideration, right? In the United States, because of the legal status quo, much less, one could say. But in Germany, for example, if you report harassing content that, according to the relevant law here in Germany, appears as they have a nice word to call it, obviously illegal, then platforms are actually obliged to make it disappear within 24 hours. Otherwise, they will receive very, very, very strong fines, which Facebook has, by the way. So I think that's an interesting question. I cannot fully answer it if business interests matter more. What I will say is that citizens' views also seem to matter. Otherwise, why do we have all this reaction from platforms?
Yes, okay. Perhaps I could just follow up on that. Perhaps platforms feel obliged to show that they listen to users because of, if you like, that is a declared policy. But I suppose behind my question is the implication that, you know, if advertisers choose not to spend money on advertising on a particular platform because of their concerns about content, about the lack of moderation, for example, then that's going to have more of a practical impact on the orientation that platforms have towards moderation. And I would note that there's some historical evidence from the history of mass media that it's business interests that have had influence over how those previous examples of mass media have evolved and the kind of content that they do or do not showcase in the platforms. I'm talking particularly about the press and the emergence back in the early 19th century of radical press and how that was throttled in over time by businesses not wanting to advertise in newspapers that professed or gave space to radical views.
Yeah, I agree. I cannot say that I do not agree to this. We've actually read a newspaper article with my colleagues some months ago because the editor of a newspaper asked us, "Is Twitter going to close in the new year?" And our argument was that, well, you know, if speech deteriorates to such a point that that advertisers will decide to, you know, decisively withdraw from the platform, then probably that's going to be the point where it's going to seriously affect the platform. That being said, and I am aware of some of this past historical evidence, we do have the example of Twitter, where we've had this very, very serious move from its most popular, its strongest advertisers, I would say, withdrawing their support. And then we had just right after that empirical evidence showing that exactly because this whole free speech absolutism, racist harassment, and a lot of other vices that I just mentioned have been increasing, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm not entirely sure about what's happening there. So we see this type of behavior increasing. There's a website that actually monitors how harassment is going on Twitter, and I haven't seen any signs of this behavior being reduced, even though advertisers have threatened, some have withdrawn, and so on and so forth. So I'm not entirely sure what to think about this at this stage. That makes sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Monica, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm interested particularly to the last graph about preference towards speech or protection from harms. I think it will be interesting if you explore more cultures such as Asia's, because I suspect that Asian countries, especially those with paternalistic leadership styles such as Singapore or even China, their citizens might say otherwise. So, yeah.
Thanks. So by mentioning China, you mean to look into this in the context of an authoritarian regime?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious whether the citizens of these countries might have different opinions about whether protection from harm is more important than free speech.
Yeah. So we have a new project, a massive new project, which is going to look at China in particular, and we're going to explore those questions. Of course, one major drawback is that, company with which we run surveys and survey experiments there is YouGov, and what you can actually ask is very, very limited. So I do not know about the extent to which we can go and replicate this type of experiment, but we do have in mind of exploring this in different types of regimes. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, any other questions? I have one, if no one else wants to put a question, Yannis, and that is, can you summarize what you think the policy implications are? What advice you would give to platforms based upon the results of your study?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So on the one hand, one is tempted to say that, if you want to take citizens and their democratic values into consideration, you should not press platforms to moderate speech, because citizens do not appear to want this, right? So on the one hand, there is that. But on the other hand, it's what I said earlier, right? I'm interested in whether, and one of the reasons why we're looking at this is because we're interested in whether there will ever be like a critical mass which can push platforms to change, to pay more attention to content moderation, right? So I don't know, while on the one hand, the implication from platforms is, keep doing what you're doing, nobody cares, or not enough people care to pressure you. On the other hand, if anyone is really interested about the health of public discourse, one has to a little bit more proactively look at how people can become more aware of the consequences of this type of behavior, so that this small, I would say, number of people who insist on stricter or any kind of content moderation that we see here can grow larger. Because I do think that the consequences, as I also showed with the empirical literature, the consequences are pretty dire from much of this type of speech. Okay,
thank you very much, Yannis, for a fascinating talk. I hope everybody is taking away some new insights into this problem. I certainly have. And I'd just like to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It has been a pleasure.